Hello, everyone. I'm Anne Marie Slaughter, Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at the Woodrow Wilson School, and it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph S. Nye on the second of the Richard Ullman Lectures. I also, just before I introduce Professor Nye, I just do want to note that Gail Ullman is here with us and certainly able at least to talk about the Ullman Lectures, to take it back to Dick. And it is, to me, a great pleasure to have the Ullman Lectures and to know that we will have lecturers of the caliber of Professor Nye to honor Dick Ullman every year. So yesterday, for those of you who were here, we established that the single most important thing Joseph Nye has done in his life is to graduate with a great class of 1958. We also established he was a Woodrow Wilson School major, even though after yesterday's lecture, Woodrow Wilson might reject him utterly. He, after graduating from Princeton, went on to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, went on to get his PhD at Harvard, and then joined the Harvard faculty, where unfortunately, despite the efforts of many, including this fine institution, he has remained as professor now in the Kennedy School. He served as dean of the Kennedy School. He served as Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration, and then later as the head of the National Intelligence Council. And I can tell you that his tenure at the National Intelligence Council was very important for shaping that institution to what it is today. We also established that he has written many important books. I think, from my point of view, the three most important, all of us could probably give three different ones. From my point of view, certainly Power and Interdependence, the book that he co-authored with Robert Keohane that really helped transform the field of international relations by talking about the parts of the world where balance of power reigns and the parts of the world that are governed more by complex interdependence, which we certainly see today. I first heard about that book sitting where you all are in 1978 in my very first international relations class, and I thought, Robert Keohane and Joseph S. Nye, some august figures somewhere out there. Little did I know they were still, they had just published the book, but the book has endured. It's now in its third edition. The second book that I think is particularly important of Professor Nye's works is Bound to Lead, which he published in 1989, right? Is that
90, I think.
1990, but it really was a contrarian book. It was right after Paul Kennedy had written The Rise and Decline of Great Powers, and Japan was taking over, and the United States was completely headed straight downhill. And Professor Nye wrote this book that said, nonsense. Actually, the United States is bound to lead, and of course, even 3 years later, but certainly 5 to 10 years later, he was a prophet. And I think that's why we need to pay particular attention to him today when he also argues against declinism, although I think that's a terrible word, those who are very quick to write off U.S. fortunes. And then finally, his book on soft power. I have to say, in 2 years in Washington, I was often struck by how soft power had really become a staple of the foreign policy landscape. I mean, it just absolutely understood that there was hard power and there was soft power, and particularly important in the military. That it really has been the military that took this to heart in many ways, that we as a nation had to focus on soft power as much as hard power, and that we had overdone it on hard power. Now, as Joe himself said and subsequently written, smart power is the combination of the two. Smart power is exactly what Secretary Clinton said she wanted to put into place when she testified before the Senate in her hearings to be Secretary of State. But we wouldn't have smart power if we didn't have the idea of soft power as well as hard. So those are my three picks, although there are many others. But the last thing I want to say today, and I could say many other things about Professor Nye, I want to salute him as a public intellectual. Here is a scholar who has been a towering figure in his field, but certainly since the mid-1990s, has really seen his role not only as a teacher, as a scholar, as a mentor, but also as a public educator. I teased him yesterday that I was meeting with Chinese diplomats, and at one point one of them said, Professor Nye has written that there has been a diffusion of power from the state to non-state actors. And with all due respect to Professor Nye, he is not the only person in the world to have observed that. But the point was, to them, it was now an established fact. His writings as a public intellectual, as an expert on national security, on American foreign policy, on power, have educated, really, I think, millions who might not ever pick up many of our scholarly journals. And that is a function that, particularly here in the Woodrow Wilson School, where we're the School of Public and International Affairs, I think we should recognize and celebrate. So I give you Professor Joseph Nye, scholar, leader, public intellectual, and Ullman lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I thought in the three most important books, you were going to mention my novel, which is called The Power Game, a Washington Novel. And the reason is that it's set in Princeton. It's about a Princeton professor who goes to Washington to try to deal with the fact that Pakistan is about to transfer nuclear weapons to Iran. Now, this was written 10 years ago. So I was afraid if I didn't publish it about then, it would become history, not fiction. But in any case, that would have been on my short list. Today I'm going to talk to you about ethics and good foreign policy leadership. And yesterday, I looked at the role of the 7 20th century leaders who presided over the creation of the American era and asked what difference their leadership contributed beyond what could be predicted by structural explanations. In addition, I asked whether those leaders who are sometimes called transformational were better than those who were transactional or called primarily transactional, and discovered that they weren't in terms of effectiveness. But yesterday, I focused primarily on causation and held off on evaluation for this second lecture, and that's what I'd like to discuss today. What is good leadership in foreign policy? Now, as I mentioned yesterday, good is an ambivalent or ambiguous word. It means both effective and ethical. And so we can say that a good sword cuts well, can be used for aggression or defense. A good thief steals a lot, even if we don't approve of what he's doing. But I think today we want to focus on the ethical side. What does good mean in terms of a foreign policy that's ethical? And we judge ethics in 3 dimensions: the ends that people or states have, the means that they use, and the consequences of their actions. Good ends or goals have to meet our moral standards as well as just feasibility. And effective means are those that achieve the goal, but ethical means are those that also pay attention to the quality, not just the efficiency of the approaches employed. As for consequences, a leader's effectiveness involves achieving the group's goal, but ethical consequences mean good results not just for the in-group that the leader is in charge of, but also for outsiders as well. Of course, in practice, effectiveness and ethics are closely related. A leader who pursues unrealistic goals or uses ineffective means can produce terrible moral consequences for followers. For example, even if we attribute good intentions to President George W. Bush in the invasion of Iraq, unrealistic goals and inadequate means had immoral consequences. Thus, inadequate contextual intelligence and reckless reality testing can produce bad consequences. Conversely, a leader whose intentions are good, who essentially says a lot of things that are wonderful and therefore is credited with moral clarity, may not necessarily have good consequences. So we want to look at all 3, ends or goals, means, and consequences when we make judgments about ethics. Now, when we talk about moral reasoning, it's important to realize that the question of the quality of moral reasoning can be separated from the issue of relativity and the ultimate proof. Some people that believe that because moral judgments are ultimately relative, they are merely a matter of personal taste, like whether you prefer vanilla or chocolate ice cream. David Brooks wrote a column in the New York Times a few weeks ago that observed that many young people today make that mistake. In Brooks's words, reflecting blind deference to authority, many of the young people have gone off the deep end to the other extreme. I would have thought, I will do what I think makes me happy or how I feel. I have no other way of knowing what to do but in how I internally feel. Now, Brooks properly criticizes that attitude because even if ultimately metaphysically based judgments can't be proven, it doesn't follow that all moral reasoning is equal. We still can apply standards to our reasoning about moral issues or ethical issues, standards such as logic, causation, and consistency to judge the quality of moral reasoning, even if we can't prove ultimate metaphysical grounding. For example, Laura Schlesinger, a religious broadcaster, argued that homosexuality is an abomination because Leviticus 8:22 says so. But Leviticus 25:44 also states that one may possess slaves provided they're purchased from neighboring nations. And one might ask Laura Schlesinger, does that make it all right for Americans to own Canadians? Or if someone says nuclear weapons are good because God gave them to us to protect the free world, one can ask why God also gave them to North Korea rather than just South Korea. We can apply reason to judge moral arguments even if we can't produce definitive proof at a metaphysical level. Now, what are the standards that we should be using to judge leaders in ethics? Should they be judged by the same moral standards as ordinary citizens? Take the biblical injunction, thou shalt not kill. That's a very good type of belief you'd look for in a spouse or a roommate. But it's also interesting to ask if you would want to vote for an absolute pacifist for president. Probably not. So it may be that sometimes leaders who have fiduciary obligations to protect people, the people who elected them, are under obligations which are different, including the idea of ordering troops into battle to take lives. In other words, sometimes leaders must have what has been called dirty hands. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, famously distinguished an ethic of ultimate ends from an ethic of responsibility. In the former, absolute moral imperatives must not be violated for the sake of good consequences, but an ethic of responsibility must focus on the results. Weber warns, and I quote him here, "He who seeks the salvation of the soul, his own soul and others, should not seek it along the avenue of politics." In the philosophical traditions of the Western Enlightenment, ethicists distinguish between a consequentialist approach, which we trace back to utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, and a deontological or rule-based approach, which you trace back to philosophers like Immanuel Kant. And the two traditions remain important strands of contemporary moral reasoning in the West today, but they're often quite difficult to reconcile. Take Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in an effort to end World War II. In a war where millions of lives had already been lost, Truman was told that he could save several 100,000 American and several 100,000 Japanese lives by dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, by avoiding a land invasion. Moreover, the numbers killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together were fewer than those who've been killed in the conventional firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden. Was Truman's act morally justified on consequentialist grounds? Strict deontologists and just war theorists would say 2 wrongs don't make a right, and that the deliberate destruction of so many innocent civilians can never be justified. For example, the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe boycotted Oxford's award of an honorary degree to Truman on those grounds. Now, some consequentialists, you might call them institutional consequentialists, might agree with her on the separate grounds that using an atomic bomb against civilians set a terrible precedent. But other consequentialists might say, on the contrary, by showing how fearsome these weapons were, they created nuclear deterrence which helped protect World War III. Moreover, they would argue that Truman later redeemed himself by refusing to use nuclear weapons when General MacArthur urged that he do so when the Korean War became stalemated. Even if Truman had refused to drop the bomb because of his personal moral beliefs, at what price does a leader's concern about personal integrity translate into selfishness and a violation of followers' trust? There are no easy answers to such problems, and recent scientific discovery suggests that evolution may have hardwired this dilemma into the human brain. My colleague Kenneth Winston argues that in daily practice, people's sense of moral obligation tends to be traced to 3 sources. One is a sense of conscience, which is personally or religiously informed and leads individuals to try to achieve a sense of moral integrity. A second involves rules of common morality that society treats as obligations for all individuals. And a third is codes of professional ethics and expectations that might be considered the duties of one's role. Leaders are subject to moral claims from all 3 of these sources, and often there's no single solution, and they're in tension with each other. And it's not surprising then that Isaiah Berlin, the great Oxford philosopher, once noted, and I quote him, "The ends of man are many, and not all of them are in principle compatible with each other. Then the possibility of conflict and tragedy can never be wholly eliminated from human life, either personal or social." Now, many societies have ethical systems that look like what we call the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that idea that my interests and your interests are treated equally often has a sensitive, intuitive appeal. John Rawls, the great liberal philosopher, used a wonderful metaphor of an imaginary veil of ignorance about our initial relative positions to illustrate what he called justice as fairness. It's a great way to approach a large number of questions. However, appealing to an intuitive sense of fairness, treating others as you would want to be treated, not playing favorites and being sensible to individual needs, does not always provide a solution. Amartya Sen invites us to imagine the following situation. There's a parent with a flute and 3 children, and each of the 3 children wants it. The first child says, "I made it." The second child says, "I'm the only one that can play it." And the third child says, "I have no other toys." Even with a thought experiment about deciding behind a veil of ignorance, it's not clear which of the 3 children should get the flute. So the principle of justice as fairness remains somewhat unclear in some cases. In such instances, the parent or the leader may find it's more appropriate to turn to a procedural or institutional solution in which the children, for example, bargain with each other, or agree on a lottery, or share, or pick a neutral figure to decide how much time of the flute will be allocated. The parent can also teach or coach the children about sharing, which is a different image of leadership as persuasion and education rather than the exercise of authority or command. teaching followers about processes and institutions, helping a group decide how to decide, is often one of the most important moral roles that leaders and parents play. Now, let me turn to an issue which I mentioned briefly yesterday, the question of risks and luck, and the role that luck plays. We often make moral judgments about how leaders distribute the risks and costs of their actions. Risk assessments of reality that impose high risks on others can be condemned on moral as well as effectiveness grounds. People who try to climb mountains accept a degree of risk when they sign up to go up a mountain. But a team leader still has to make sure that the whole group understands the balance between risk and achievement. It's one thing to pose a grand vision and challenge that leads people up a mountain. It's another to lead them too close to the edge of the cliff without informing them. Now, there's another issue that we need to consider about how we judge leaders and their actions, and that's what the philosopher Bernard Williams called moral luck. We talked about this briefly yesterday when we talked about Wilson's stroke. Bernard Williams points out that the painter Paul Gauguin deserted his French family to travel to Tahiti, where he produced some of the great works of the modern period of art. And there, the question is whether he was justified in his mistreatment of his family. And the argument is that if Gauguin's ship had sunk on the way to Tahiti, he would be remembered today primarily as a run-of-the-mill French painter and a callous man who deserted his family. Williams argues, however, that in our moral reasoning about such cases, it matters how intrinsic the cause of the failure is to the project itself. A shipwreck, Williams says, is too external to unjustify Gauguin, something which only his failure as a painter could do. And even then, one could distinguish failing as a painter because of indolence or because of inadequate talent. Had Gauguin reached Tahiti and failed as a painter, we would not justify his desertion of his family. The stroke that felled Woodrow Wilson in the midst of his campaign for the ratification of the Versailles Treaty was like a shipwreck. But Wilson's stubborn refusal to permit compromise was to a political leader as failure to paint well would have been for Gauguin. Now, some dimensions of luck are purely fortuitous. Machiavelli warned us of the role of fortuna, but people can also help to make their luck. And judging luck requires a baseline of what would be reasonable estimate of probability of success and how much risk to assume in the circumstances and who will bear the costs. Jimmy Carter had bad luck when a helicopter collided with an airplane during the attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran. George W. Bush encountered bad luck in some of the aspects of his efforts at nation building and stabilization in Iraq. But some of the bad luck arose from reckless reality testing and inadequate attention to detail. Reckless reality testing and unnecessary risk-taking may be part of bad luck, and it is that dimension that deserves moral blame rather than the part that is pure chance. Conversely, many sports teams analyze their opponent's game so that they can capitalize on errors and benefit from good luck. In football games, turnovers of possession of the ball start with one team's error, but the outcome then depends on the preparation and skill of the other team. The contextual intelligence and prudent judgments of Eisenhower or George H.W. Bush that we discussed yesterday contributed to the lucky avoidance of any nuclear incidents that would have disrupted the creation of the American era. And because we weigh consequences so heavily in our moral judgments of leaders, history tells us to be kind to the lucky and unkind to the unlucky, but we can still judge them in terms of the means they used and the causes of their luck and how they capitalized on that luck. That still leaves open another question left over from yesterday, which is the question of when to judge. What's the appropriate point? Wilson failed to bring his country into the League of Nations, as we saw, but a quarter century later, the U.S. joined the United Nations. George W. Bush liked to make comparisons to Harry Truman, who was unpopular at the end of the Korean War, but then regained his standing with historians. I mentioned yesterday in the question and answer period that Truman's biographer, David McCullough, said that basically about 50 years has to pass before you can appraise a presidency in its entirety. The dust has to settle. But this is far too lax a standard to help us make judgments in the here and now. For one thing, the more distant an outcome is in time, the more other causes feed into the chain of causation, and the more difficult to credit or blame an act by a leader a half a century earlier. So, for example, if the Middle East turns out to be democratic in the year 2050, to say that it was caused by Bush's actions in invading Iraq in 2003 leaves open all the other causes that might have contributed to that in the intervening half century. Now, one of the most important skills of good leaders is to design and maintain systems and institutions. Well-designed institutions include means for self-correction as well as means of constraining the failures of leaders. Poorly designed or led institutions can lead people astray. Obedience to institutional authority can be bad at times. Several decades ago, there was a famous experiment at Yale in which students were encouraged to administer shocks to other students. Another experiment that's famous was carried out at Stanford, a so-called prison experiment in which students were encouraged to play the game of warder and prisoners, which showed an extraordinary ability to get even intelligent people to submit blindly to authority. Now, if we think of the recent case of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, it reminds us of both the importance and the danger of poorly designed institutions. The Abu Ghraib guards were reservists without special training who lacked supervision and were given the task of softening up detainees. It's not surprising that the result was various forms of torture. The moral flaws, however, were not simply in the prison guards, but also in the higher level leaders who created and failed to monitor a flawed institutional framework. So good leadership is not merely inspiring people with a noble vision, but involves creating and maintaining the systems and institutions that allow effective and moral implementation. This is a test that Teddy Roosevelt failed in the Philippines. It's quite striking. I'm not going to discuss this in detail today, but it's quite striking when you go back and read about Roosevelt's suppression of the insurgency in the Philippines in the early 1900s, how similar it is to Abu Ghraib, waterboarding on all. And it's also interesting that Ronald Reagan articulated inspiring visions while George H.W. Bush did not. But Reagan's inattention to institutions and details produced the Iran-Contra scandal, while George H.W. Bush's well-organized processes avoided potential accidents during the dismantling of the Cold War. That good outcome depended on more than so-called dumb luck. Let me finally turn to the question of terms of ways we judge leaders by the question of identities and leaders as teachers of the public. It's worth remembering that leaders can be judged not only on their effectiveness in achieving group goals, but also on the meaning that they create and how they teach their followers. Inspirational leaders often use periods of crises as teaching moments to educate their followers about new perspectives and the need for change. Inspirational leaders with transformational goals have often played major roles in history. the world would be a far poorer place without the existence of leaders such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King. One of the most important ways in which leaders produce meaning is by establishing or changing a group's identity. They help a group to understand who is us and how should we treat them. It's far easier to reinforce the status quo than to change identity, yet the moral implications can be immense. Most leaders feed upon the existing identity and solidarity of their own groups. In that sense, they are insular, and they define their responsibilities to their group in a traditional manner. But some leaders see moral obligations beyond the immediate group and take actions to educate their followers about them. For example, Nelson Mandela, as I mentioned yesterday, could easily have chosen to define his group as Black South Africans and sought revenge for the injustice of decades of apartheid. Instead, he worked tirelessly to expand the identity of his followers, both by words and deeds. In contrast, political entrepreneurs in Bosnia and Iraq manipulated identities for selfish purposes and had tragic consequences. In an age of globalization and the changes that globalization is creating, one of the important problems and tasks for leaders in the future is going to be to make sense of what's an in-group, what's an out-group, and what we owe each other. And that brings me to the question of duties beyond borders. Not only are ethical standards for judging leaders more complicated than those we use for judging fellow citizens in daily life, but the domain of foreign policy adds an additional level of complexity. To what extent should leaders pay attention to the rights, institutions, and welfare of those who are not their fellow citizens? Skeptics argue that where there is no sense of community, there are no moral rights and no moral duties, and that the classic statement about ethics in international politics is the Athenian response to the Melians' plea for mercy. The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. If international relations were simply the realm of kill or be killed, then presumably there's no choice, and where there's no choice, there's little role for morality. But international politics consists of more than mere survival, and pretending that choices do not exist is merely a disguised form of choice. To think only in narrow terms of national interests is simply smuggling in values without admitting it. A French diplomat once told me in a debate about nuclear weapons in the height of the Cold War that in his view, what is moral is what is good for France. But he ducked the question of why it was only French interests that should be considered. The leader who says, "I had no choice," often did have a choice, albeit not a pleasant one. Now, we often say that international politics is anarchic. That's true. Anarchy means without government. States, according to Hobbes, have leviathans which help to keep order. But there is no leviathan for international politics. International affairs has, however, a set of rudimentary practices and institutions that provide enough order to allow some important choices. Institutions such as balance of power, international laws and norms, and international organizations. These practices can help provide help in the iterative game of prisoner's dilemma, and there's some evidence that international violence has decreased over time, as Steven Pinker argues in his recent book. But even where violence hasn't decreased, or where you have the extreme instance of war, law and morality sometimes play a role. The just war doctrine, which originated in the early Christian church as Augustine and other early church fathers wrestled with the dilemma that if the good did not fight back, then surely the good would perish and the bad would prevail. and developed the just war principles to try to set limits to fighting back, that doctrine has survived and become secularized after the 17th century, and today provides a broad normative structure that considers all three dimensions of good ends, discriminating and proportional means, and the probability of successful consequences. Even more to the point for American foreign policy leaders is that their followers demand that they include moral considerations in foreign policy. Americans like to believe that our country and culture represents a higher moral standard than that of the old world from which we seceded. American exceptionalism is based on liberal ideas and the view that the American colonists had rejected the bad old ways of the Europe they had left behind. That's one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson's arguments for entering World War I had more appeal than the balance of power approach of Teddy Roosevelt. Thus, moral issues are inescapable for American foreign policy leaders. Their followers demand it. Nonetheless, different perceptions affect the way leaders frame their moral choices. Realists see a world composed primarily of states. Liberals see a world of peoples with rights, and cosmopolitans stress the importance of individuals. However, these simple categories are not exclusive. In practice, leaders mix these views in sometimes inconsistent ways when they formulate policies. As a result, there's no single view on what duties Americans owe foreigners, and when or what types of intervention are moral or not. Walter Mead has identified at least four major American traditions, one stemming back to Andrew Jackson and thinks in narrow and impatient national terms, a Hamiltonian tradition placing more emphasis on national interest in the context of a balance of power. Third, a Jeffersonian tradition stressing American moralism in a more unilateral context, and a Wilsonian tradition that's more cosmopolitan. An insular leader thinks only of the concerns of his own group, but a moral leader also considers the types and degrees of consequences for those who are not members of that in-group. The image of a community of humankind may be a weak outer circle in a set of concentric circles of identity, but it still involves some degree of moral duties beyond borders. The leadership theorist Barbara Kellerman has accused President Clinton, Bill Clinton, of insular leadership in failing to respond to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And Clinton himself has criticized his reactions. Yet had Clinton tried to send American troops, he would have encountered stiff resistance in parts of his administration, the Congress, and public opinion. Particularly after the death of American soldiers in a humanitarian intervention in Somalia, Clinton's followers were not ready for another intervention. Clinton has acknowledged he could have done more to help the UN and other nations to save some of the lives that were lost in Rwanda, but good leaders today are often caught between their cosmopolitan inclinations and their more traditional obligations to the followers who have elected them. Insularity, then, is not an all-or-nothing moral dimension. In a world in which people are organized in national communities, a purely cosmopolitan ideal is unrealistic. But as Kwame Anthony Appiah puts it, "Thou shalt not kill is a test you take pass-fail. Honor thy father and mother admits of gradations." And that same admission of gradations is true of cosmopolitanism versus insularity. We may admire leaders who make efforts to increase their followers' concerns for the consequences of their actions on the outgroup, but it does little good to hold them to an impossible standard whose pursuit would undercut their capacity to remain leaders. That brings me to a question of types of Americans and insularity and what we owe followers. If we look at this little table, you'll see that those who are unilateral in their means and nationalist in their goals or ends include isolationists and Jacksonians. Their view is that Americans owe little to others, either in ends or means. If one looks, however, at the Wilsonian tradition, you'll see that it stresses more cosmopolitan ends and multilateral means. Wilson wished a world with self-determination made safe for democracy, but through the multilateral means of his League of Nations. Neoconservatives who pressed for the invasion of Iraq shared some Wilsonian cosmopolitan goals, but with less attention to others to the means that they followed. In contrast, traditional realists such as Henry Kissinger or Brent Scowcroft focused more on national interest in the context of alliances and institutions. Now, no leader fits purely in one or another of these boxes, and new issues and crises will constantly present new and changing contexts. But this helps to show you something of the distribution of views in recent American foreign policy debates about duties beyond borders. How then should we judge the ethics of presidents in foreign policy? Basically, one finds that the key that's often cited is prudence. Robert Jackson makes an argument that prudence is so important that it's a moral as well as an instrumental concept. Or Arnold Wilfers, the great European theorist, argued that the best one can hope for in judging the ethics of leaders in foreign policy is that they made, and then here are his words, the best moral choices that circumstances permit. I like Wilfers, but I find that too loose a standard, because how do you know what were the best choices that circumstances would permit? What I argue is that you can take some of the thoughts that I discussed earlier relating to ends, means, and consequences and get a somewhat more refined way to judge the moral and ethical positions that leaders have taken. We can get this from Rawls, we can get it from just war theory, and so forth. Thus, the criteria I will use in judging goals, and I've tried to outline these in the next table, include a vision that expresses widely attractive values at home and abroad, but prudently balances those values and assesses risks so that there's a reasonable prospect of their success. This means we judge a president not only on his character and intentions, but also on his contextual intelligence when it comes to assessing his ends. As for means, I've included criteria borrowed from just war theory, such as proportional and discriminate use of force, as well as Rawls's liberal concern for minimal degrees of intervention in order to respect the rights and institutions of others. As for consequences, I judge whether a president succeeded in promoting American long-term interests and whether he respected the cosmopolitan values by avoiding extreme insularity, and whether he educated followers to try to create and broaden moral standards. Now, this checklist is far from complete and adequate. People can add others as they wish, but at least it gives us something for guidance that goes beyond that rather loose standard of prudence and whatever the best circumstances permit. Ken Winston says that in applied ethics, cases are mini-stories that, when carefully selected and effectively taught, help practitioners develop the competencies they need to act effectively and well in public life. So let's look at 3 of the 7 presidents we discussed and how they behaved as case studies. Let me start, of course, as appropriate for this setting, with Woodrow Wilson, who described himself as an idealist, and his words, an idealist with the heart of a poet. Also has been described by a biographer as a Presbyterian priest, that essentially he often found occasion to interpret as the Lord's will convictions other men attributed to less remote sources, and occasion to hallow and moralize issues that other men considered secular or casual. Wilson could be notably stubborn about compromise. In the view of Alexander and Juliet George, Wilson's self-esteem was damaged during his strict upbringing by his Presbyterian pastor father, and he found that to compromise meant to yield to interference with that sphere of authority in which he sought contemporary gratification. Whatever the merits of this interpretation of the origins of the stubbornness, one should not exaggerate its impact on Wilson's effectiveness as a politician under normal circumstances. In the words of his biographer, John Milton Cooper, Wilson was one of the most careful, hard-headed, and sophisticated idealists of his time. Like Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson shared the racial prejudices as well as the prevailing Anglo-Saxon chauvinism of his times. He did not hesitate to intervene in Mexico and the Caribbean. On the other hand, while Wilson justified his policies with a realist analysis, Roosevelt justified his policies with a realist analysis, Wilson's vision of the international system had liberal elements. These liberal elements were not original with Wilson, but he synthesized them into an effective system. Wilson did not coin the term self-determination for peoples, but he adopted it, although not fully confronting all the implications of that ambiguous principle, and it was applied at Versailles in a very imperfect fashion. He understood balance of power, but he believed that a League of Nations based upon a collective security alliance would be more peaceful and more moral. And contrary to many caricatures, Wilson did not launch a crusade for democracy. In his 1917 war message to Congress, he was careful to use the passive tense. He talked about the world must be made safe for democracy, as opposed to we make the world safe for democracy. And a year later, he told journalists, there isn't any one kind of government which we have the right to impose upon any other nation, so that I am not fighting for democracy except for those who want democracy. In other words, we have to be careful not to caricature Wilson as a rigid ideologue who was unthinking. How then should we judge Wilson's goals and visions? Was it really as impractical as critics have portrayed it? Arthur Link, a great biographer of Wilson, who is here at Princeton, of course, wrote a piece about what he called the higher realism of Woodrow Wilson. Link argues that the so-called realists at Versailles lived in a dream, a nightmare of unreality that produced the flawed settlement that laid the basis for World War II. In Link's words, over and over, Wilson argued that this was the only kind of peace that would prove acceptable to the American people in the short run and to the moral opinion of the world in the long run. In short, the only kind of settlement that could endure. Link notes that George Kennan, another eminent Princeton realist, revised his views of Wilson in 1991. At that point, Kennan concluded that, in Kennan's words, in his vision of the future needs of world society, I now see Wilson as ahead of any other statesman of his time. But Link's and Kennan's revised assessment raises an interesting question about ethical foreign policy leadership. If a leader diagnoses a problem correctly in the long run, but not in the short run, or if a leader lacks the requisite leadership skills to implement the diagnosis, the result is a failure of leadership. Link may be correct that Clemenceau and Orlando's classical European balance of power approach set the scene for German revanchism and the tragedy of the 1930s. But it's also true that the tragedy of the 1930s was because sensible policy fell between two stools of balance of power and collective security visions. Both Clemenceau and Wilson share some of the blame for the 1930s debacle that Link blames solely on Wilson's opponents. Perhaps if Wilson had possessed the leadership skill to ensure American participation in the League, this outcome might not have been forestalled. But this lack of emotional intelligence and his mismanagement of the process at Versailles and later in the bargaining with the Senate contributed to the failure. Wilson's limited contextual intelligence about international affairs meant that he was not sufficiently alert to the pitfalls that awaited him. Despite his noble vision, Wilson's failure as an effective leader led to an unintended but foreseeable consequences that contributed to his failure as an ethical leader. And sadly, the situation was made worse by the moral bad luck of his untimely stroke. Where Wilson succeeded ethically was not as a foreign policy leader, but as a thought leader. Even though his ideas were not implemented for more than 2 decades, they strongly affected his successors, particularly Franklin Roosevelt and Truman. As John Morton Blum concludes, Wilson's triumph was as a teacher, his lesson written in the copybooks of generations unborn when he taught. In this dimension, Wilson exceeded Teddy Roosevelt. But there's a difference between leadership in ideas and leadership in policy. Wilson had a less insular vision than Teddy Roosevelt, but less contextual intelligence in shaping a prudent balance between values and risks. Wilson's means were more respectful of the rights of others than were those of Teddy Roosevelt, and in terms of long-term consequences, he did more to raise and broaden moral standards, but in their own time, Roosevelt proved to be the more successful in achieving the goals of its followers. Let me take the second of the 3 cases, which is Ronald Reagan. Reagan is often cited as the exemplar of a moral foreign policy, par excellence. A movement conservative, he's remembered for speeches that issued a strong call for moral clarity. In the Westminster speech, in which he predicted that Marxism-Leninism would wind up on the ash heap of history, in Florida in 1983, when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and in Berlin in 1987, when he demanded Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. Reagan believed that there were simple answers to many of our problems, but in his words, simple doesn't mean easy. It's the complicated answers that are easy because it avoids facing hard moral issues. But when people call today for a Reaganite foreign policy, they tend to mean the moral clarity that went with Reagan's simplification of complex issues and his effective rhetoric in the presentation of values. Not only is this an inadequate moral reasoning, for reasons I mentioned earlier, it doesn't look at means and consequences in addition to intentions, but it also mistakes the success of Reagan's moral leadership, which included the ability to bargain and compromise as he pursued his policies. For example, when asked in the 1988 Moscow summit whether he still considered the Soviet Union to be an evil empire, Reagan replied, "I was talking about another time, another era." Nonetheless, clear and clearly stated objectives can educate and motivate the public. The key question is whether Reagan was prudent in balancing aspirations and risks in his goals and objectives. Some people have argued that his initial rhetoric in his first term created a dangerous degree of tension and distrust in U.S.-Soviet relations that increased the prospect of accidental or miscalculated nuclear war. But it also created incentives to bargain, which Reagan put to good advantage when Gorbachev came to power in Reagan's second term. As for insularity, Reagan expressed his values in universal terms, though he is sometimes accused of hypocrisy for focusing on Soviet violations of human rights while ignoring the violations perpetrated by a number of American third world clients. With regard to means, Reagan had a mixed record. The circumvention of legal means during the Iran-Contra issue set a bad precedent, and the Reagan doctrine of covert action to fight wars against leftist regimes in Central America also included the mining of harbors in Nicaragua, a country with which the Americans were at peace. In terms of consequences, Reagan undoubtedly advanced the national interests of the United States, though, as I argued yesterday, much of the credit for ending the Cold War in the Soviet Union belongs to Gorbachev. In any event, Reagan took good advantage of the opportunity in a manner that was not limited just to insular American interests. Reagan's moralistic rhetoric broadened moral discourse at home and abroad, but it was sometimes subverted by actions such as support for apartheid in South Africa that appeared hypocritical in terms of the values that Reagan proclaimed for himself and his country. By and large, Ronald Reagan had an ethical foreign policy in the goals he set, and most of the larger consequences to which he contributed, but not always in the means that he used. Finally, let's look at George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush had a strong sense of civic responsibility and a wide governmental experience before becoming president, and that gave him the best contextual intelligence of any president since Eisenhower. My colleague Nicholas Burns, a former Foreign Service officer who served under Bush, argues that Bush's accomplishments in ending the Cold War, unifying Germany, amassing the Gulf War coalition that defeated Saddam Hussein in that same year, and then pivoting to start Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at Madrid, make him arguably the most successful foreign policy president of the last 50 years. As I argued yesterday, and in his own account, Bush did not have transformational objectives. Instead, he was interested in avoiding disaster in a world that was changing dramatically. As he and his team responded to the forces that were largely outside of his control, he set goals and objectives that balanced opportunities and realism in a prudent manner. For example, some critics have faulted him for not doing more on the national aspirations of the Soviet republics like Ukraine in 1990, or failing to go all the way to Baghdad to unseat Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War, or for sending Brent Scowcroft to negotiate with the Chinese after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. But in all these instances, Bush was limiting his short-run objectives in order to pursue what he saw as long-term stability as a goal. As we saw yesterday, other critics have complained that Bush did not set more transformational objectives in relation to Russian democracy or the Middle East or nonproliferation at a time when politics seemed quite fluid. But again, Bush remained focused on questions of stability without new visions. In ethical terms, although Bush did not express a strong moral vision, it is difficult to make the case that he should have been less prudent and taken more risk. As for means, Bush was respectful of institutions and norms both at home and abroad, going to Congress for authorization in the Gulf War and using a resolution of Chapter 7 under the UN Charter for the Gulf War. Although a realist in his thinking, he could be Wilsonian in his tactics. In terms of proportionate and discriminate use of force, Bush's termination of the ground war in Iraq after only 4 days was motivated in part by humanitarian reactions to the slaughter. Bush's invasion of Panama to remove Manuel Noriega may have violated some particular norms of sovereignty, but I think the de facto legitimacy came from Noriega's notorious behavior. And when Bush organized his coalition to prosecute the Gulf War, he not only worked with the United Nations, but included a number of Arab countries who were not needed for military purposes, but for legitimacy, and the legitimacy he added to the coalition. With this careful combination of hard and soft power, Bush established a policy that raised moral standards at home and abroad and was capable of being sustainable into the future. In terms of consequences, Bush was a worthy fiduciary in accomplishing American goals and managed to do so in a manner that was not unduly insular and with minimal damage to the interests of foreigners. He was careful not to humiliate Gorbachev and to manage the transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin. At the same time, not all foreigners were adequately protected. For example, when Bush assigned a lower priority to Kurds in northern Iraq, to dissidents in China, or to Bosnians who were embroiled into civil war in the former Yugoslavia. In that sense, Bush's realism set limits to his cosmopolitanism. Ironically, one of his final acts, sending American Marines to Somalia to save starving civilians, was a violation of his realism and in the end turned out badly for his successor. Could Bush have done more under the circumstances? Possibly, or he might have done more if he'd been elected to a second term, and losing that opportunity was an instance of bad moral luck. And with a better set of communication skills, Bush might have been able to do more to educate the American public about changing nature of the world they faced after the Cold War. But given the uncertainties of history, I'm tempted to agree with Nicholas Burns, that Bush had one of the best foreign policies of the past century in both the effective and ethical meaning of the term. Let me summarize this then by asking what is an ethical foreign policy and how the various presidents have stacked up on this. I concluded at the end of yesterday's lecture that contrary to the assumptions of leadership theory that transformational leaders are better in terms of effectiveness, that there is no such record, and the same conclusion holds for better in its ethical meaning. While the judgments in this table are crude summaries of complex phenomena, the best record goes to the incremental and transactional record of George H.W. Bush, and the poorest records belong to the transformational and inspirational leaders, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. In sum, most of the creators of the American era had good objectives, but some used questionable means. The United States, the results for the United States and the consequences of the United States were mostly good, and their consequences for non-Americans were mixed. In concluding, it's worth noticing that the 21st century began with an extraordinary imbalance of power and a great complacency about foreign policy. You may remember that foreign policy played almost no role in the election of 2000. But September 2001 led to a transformation in foreign policy. And George W. Bush, who started as a limited realist with little interest in foreign policy, quickly became a transformational leader. That transformation failed at home, and it also failed abroad. And Obama won in 2008 on an argument that American power depended upon its prudent use, as he put it in his inaugural address. And when Obama had to intervene, or chose to intervene militarily in Libya by enforcing a no-fly zone, he was careful first to obtain the soft power protection of an Arab League and UN resolution to share the military leadership of France and Britain, which was a sharp contrast to the invasion of Iraq. While it's still too early to be definitive in historical judgments about the Iraq War, I think it is fair to say that the 21st century opened with a crisis that led to a failed transformational policy. It's interesting to compare Bush with the transformational leaders of the 20th century, and it's also interesting to see that he was very keen on being seen as transformational, and that his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, praised the virtues of transformational diplomacy. But it's not clear that that helped him in dealing with the new set of problems that we faced with the new century. There's little evidence, then, I would argue, to support the general assumption of leadership theory and public discourse that transformational foreign policy leaders are better in either ethics or effectiveness. For one thing, the concept of transformational leadership is too ambiguous to be useful in this form, but even with the objectives distinguished from style, the evidence does not support the view that transformational leaders with transformational objectives are better. Other leadership skills that we talked about yesterday are more important. One might compare, usefully, Woodrow Wilson with George H.W. Bush. In the long run, Wilson's vision was partially vindicated, but he lacked the leadership skill for its execution and implementation in his own time. With Bush 41, the vision thing and his educational impact were very limited, but his execution and management were very good. Perhaps the facetious moral of this story is that at some mythical day in the future, genetic engineers will be able to produce leaders equally endowed with both sets of skills. But comparing the two Bushes, who shared half their genes, makes it clear that nature has not yet solved the problem. A big problem in foreign policy is the complexity of the context. We live in a world of diverse cultures and know very little about social engineering and how to, in quotes, build nations. When we cannot be sure how to improve the world, prudence becomes an important virtue, and hubristic visions can pose a grave danger. In foreign policy, as in medicine, it's important to remember the Hippocratic Oath. At first, do no harm. For these reasons, the virtue of transactional leaders with good contextual intelligence are very important. A Bush 41 without the ability to articulate a vision, but who's able to steer successfully through crises, turns out to be a better leader than a Bush 43 with a powerful vision but little contextual intelligence. In trying to explain the role of Secretary of State, Reagan's secretary, George Shultz, of course a proud alumnus of the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton, once compared it to gardening, the constant nurturing of a complex array of actors, interests, and goals. But Shultz's Stanford colleague and former student, Condoleezza Rice, wanted a more transformational diplomacy, in not accepting the world as it is, but trying to change it. As one commentator put it, Rice's ambition was to be not just a gardener, she wanted also to be a landscape architect. There's a role for both, depending on the context, but we should avoid the common mistake of automatically thinking that the transformational landscape architect is a better leader than the careful gardener. Finally, let me say that as we try to deal with this century in an election year, we're noticing a great deal of discussion about American decline. I wrote a book last year, The Future of Power, which argued that there are major power shifts going on this century, but that decline is a misleading metaphor for us to understand what we're doing. America is not in absolute decline, and in relative terms, there's a reasonable probability that it's likely to remain more powerful than any other single state in the coming decades. We do not live in a post-American world, but neither do we live anymore in the American era of the late 20th century. We will be faced with a rise in the power resources of many others, both states and non-state actors. We'll also face an increasing number of issues in which obtaining our preferred outcomes will require power with others as much as over others. American capacity to maintain alliances and create networks, which Anne Marie Slaughter has written so well about, will be an important dimension of our hard and soft power. The problem of America's role in the 21st century is not one of a poorly specified decline, but developing the contextual intelligence to understand that even the largest country cannot achieve its outcomes it wants without the help of others. Educating the public to both understand and operate successfully in this complex globalized information age will be the real transformation leadership task of this century. Thank you very much.